freedom of the press rests on the shoulders of this one young lady. And if she didn't get to ask her questions in the way that she wanted to ask them, at the time that she wanted to ask them, in the place that she wanted to ask them, well then, it endangers our freedom of the press, don't you know? BS. Freedom of the press. Which, as I hear it, is under great threat in this country. The Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, all of them. Great threat from this administration. The freedom of the press. How so, you might ask? Well, there's actually a good piece at the Daily Wire on this subject by a gentleman by the name of Joseph Curl. So let's first lay this out, and then I want to lay out something else that you haven't heard today. To hear the liberal media tell it, the horrible Trump administration, bent on destroying the First Amendment, has barred a legitimate journalist from covering the White House. Or as the New York Times put it, the White House barred a CNN journalist from attending a public appearance by President Trump in the Rose Garden on Wednesday, an apparent act of retaliation that drew immediate rebuke from news organizations and signaled the latest escalation of Mr. Trump's hostilities toward the news media. Once again, that's not the full story. And just for the record, a lie of omission is still a lie. The Times quotes Caitlin Collins, a White House correspondent for CNN, saying she was chastised for asking inappropriate questions. We played this yesterday, didn't we, Mr. Producer? And they did not like the questions I asked President Trump about the news of the day, Collins said. That, she claimed, led to the White House barring her from the following press event in the White House Rose Garden. But White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders offered a very different account. She says that's actually not what happened. At the conclusion of a press event in the Oval Office, a reporter shouted questions and refused to leave, despite repeatedly being asked to do so, Sanders said in a statement. Subsequently, our staff informed her she was not welcome to participate in the next event, but made clear that any other journalist from her network could attend. Do you see how the media humiliate themselves? Do you see how the media lie? And immediately, and I pointed this out yesterday, Fox and other news organizations circled the wagons around CNN. They didn't want to be left out. They didn't want to be seen as not supporting the First Amendment. This has nothing to do with the First Amendment. This has nothing to do with freedom of speech. Inquiries are not being shut down. Questions are not being shut down. This young lady was disruptive. You can't have that in a newsroom. You can't have that on a football field. You can't have it in a classroom. You can't have it in a courthouse. You can't have it at a congressional hearing. You can ask questions. You can ask tough questions. But wait your turn. Right place, right time. It's not as if the media aren't free to cover Donald Trump. They don't stop covering Donald Trump. So subsequently, our staff informed her she wasn't welcome to participate in the next event. Now, of course, the she refused to lead part wasn't reported by the media. Far different from the versions you're hearing in the mainstream media. And Collins herself noted that CNN wasn't barred from the event. She said on CNN that she was told, we're not banning your network, your photographers can still come, your producers can still come, but you are not invited to the Rose Garden today. Now, the Times reports that in the Oval Office, Collins shouted, did Michael Cohen betray you, Mr. President? And then, Mr. President, are you worried about what Michael Cohen is about to say to prosecutors? Actually, she asked 6 questions. 6. But it wasn't the questions she asked, it was the venue. Quote, to be clear, we support a free press and ask that everyone be respectful of the presidency and guests at the White House, Sanders said. Trump had just concluded an Oval Office meeting with European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker in the White House when the press was allowed in. Having covered the White House for 12 years, he says, I know a bit about this. To be sure, reporters do yell questions at the president all the time, say on the White House lawn, at Andrews Air Force Base, in a White House press conference, or just about anywhere other than the Oval Office, he says. And it's not only right for them to do so, it's their job, one the American people expect them to do. In the Oval Office, though, reporters are expected to handle themselves with a bit of decorum. It's the man's office, after all, and the press was invited in. Yelling repeated questions at the president and refusing to leave is absolutely inappropriate. Collins asked the fifth question twice, so 6 questions. In an Oval Office spray, that's what they call it apparently, it's cool to ask 1 question, maybe a second on your way out, but 6? And you can watch the video yourself, folks. Just as fellow CNN White House correspondent Jim Acosta has been doing since day one of the Trump administration, Collins is clearly trying to get famous by being tough on the president. But she's not being tough. She's being rude. Ask a question, maybe 2, and then get out. So now that's a new tactic by the press. Get into the Oval Office, then simply refuse to leave. When Trump tires of the tactic, and he will, and bars the entire press corps from his office, then the mainstream media will be up in arms. And when that happens, they should perhaps direct some of their ire towards Collins and Acosta. There's a way to do the job, a very difficult job, without being rude. Give it a try, White House press corps. You just might like it. No, you don't understand. Trump is threatening freedom of the press. What a pathetic joke. I want to remind you of Barack Obama in the Rose Garden, June 15, 2012, with a reporter by the name of Neil Monroe, working for the Daily Caller at the time. How Obama cut him off and shut him down, and the media agreed with him. No circling the wagons around Mr. Monroe. Cut 1, go.
It is the right thing to do. Excuse me, sir. It's not time for questions, sir. Not while I'm speaking. And the answer to your question, sir, and the next time I prefer you let me finish my statements before you ask that question, is this is the right thing to do for the American people. Baby, I didn't ask for an argument. I'm answering your question. It is the right thing to do for the American people, and here's why. Here's the reason. Because these young people are going to make extraordinary contributions.
And Mr. Producer, he dug and dug and dug. And I want you to listen to this montage as a result of Neil Monroe questioning a different president, Obama, in the Rose Garden. Not about federal prosecutors, not about his private attorney, about actual policy issues, may I add. And guess what? Monroe's interruption was racist. Cut 2, go.
It's very, very difficult to place race outside of this context. Certainly in my experience, it's hard to divorce that because this president doesn't look like the others.
And I think a lot of the same thing is happening with our Attorney General. We've got these are 2 men who are doing an outstanding job. But there are folks who just don't like it, and they've never treated other folks like this, but here they are doing it to these gentlemen.
Is it because they're both black?
I think that probably has something to do with it.
This disrespect of this human being cannot be disconnected from the fact that he's black.
You have to ask the question, would the right wing be doing this if we had a white president there?
And any person who doesn't believe that race plays some role in that is floating down the river of denial.
Wow. Race again. It's race. I don't remember news organizations putting out statements defending Neil Monroe, do you? And he wasn't in the Oval Office. The time wasn't cut off. Obama wasn't with another foreign leader. He wasn't being asked about prosecutors and such investigating him, because that never happened, of course, because he's Obama and they'd never do that. But he was asked a policy question. April Ryan on CNN Today, a leftist. Cut 3, go.
But then CNN had that exclusive with those Cohen Trump tapes. They were angry. Yeah. They were angry. And now this. There is retaliation. And this administration doesn't look good. This president was sworn in, taking the oath of office to support the Constitution. In the First Amendment, the very First Amendment is freedom of the press. Yeah. He is violating his oath. This is not good.
This is a reporter, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm sure she cares deeply about the Second Amendment, the 10th Amendment, the Appointments Clause, and Article 5, Convention of States. No, she doesn't. I love the way the left throws around the Constitution. I even love the way the media throw around freedom of the press. There's other parts in the First Amendment that they don't even believe in, like religious liberty. Then there's Wolf Blitzer, yesterday on CNN. Cut 4, go.
I mean, it's something you would expect to see in some totalitarian regime.
Ah, there we go. I'm surprised he didn't say Hitler's Third Reich. All because we have another CNN reporter who's utterly unprofessional. Go ahead.
With presidents around the world at photo opportunities, the host government wasn't happy that White House correspondents were shouting questions. They weren't happy about that.
Look, moron, everybody knows what's going on here. Everybody knows what's going on. It was in the Oval Office. Question time was over. And your reporter was unprofessional, was disruptive, lobbing 6 questions at the President of the United States. She wouldn't leave the Oval Office. Somebody ought to try that with Wolf Blitzer in the studio on air. Start lobbing questions at him and refuse to leave and say, hey, I can do this. I believe in freedom of speech. Freedom of speech. You can't throw me out. What are you, a tyrant with a totalitarian mindset? They love the Constitution, except when it comes to most of it. Separation of powers, the Second Amendment. I mean, I can go on and on and on. Hilarious, isn't it? When Neil Monroe in 2012 did what he did, CBS News took note. Quote, during President Obama's event in the White House Rose Garden on the administration's new immigration rules regarding children of undocumented immigrants, a reporter interrupted the president mid-sentence with the question, is it the right thing to do for American workers? Interrupting the president is considered a violation of decorum and is rarely done. This is CBS. The reporter, Neil Monroe, the conservative website, The Daily Caller, said after the event he was asking questions because you guys weren't. So they chastise him. Chastise him. ABC News. Barack Obama's campaign, this is in 2008, has booted from its airplane 3 reporters who work for newspapers that have endorsed John McCain. Anybody accuse Barack Obama of being a tyrant? Of wanting to run a totalitarian regime? The campaign says that a limited number of seats forced it to make the tough decision of which journalists would be permitted, so he gets rid of the conservatives. Gets rid of them. And by the way, Glamour magazine and others were allowed to stay on the plane. Just thought you'd want to know, Mr. First Amendment. Then I looked up and I followed this piece by James Risen of the New York Times. If Donald Trump targets journalists, thank Obama. What? What? Oh, yeah. More on that when I return.
Mark Levin.
I need to give this piece some justice because of all the hyper phony reporting going on about threats to free press in this country. We stand by CNN. I don't stand by CNN at all. I stand by freedom of the press. James Risen, no right-winger, investigative reporter of the New York Times at the time. Donald Trump decides as president to I'm going to start it now and then finish it after the bottom of the hour, so stick with me, please. If Donald Trump decides as president to throw a whistleblower in jail for trying to talk to a reporter, or gets the FBI to spy on a journalist, he will have one man to thank for bequeathing him such expansive power, Barack Obama. Anybody remember the media as an aggregate, as a whole, rising up against Barack Obama? Mr. Trump made his animus toward the news media clear during the presidential campaign, often expressing his disgust with the coverage through Twitter or in diatribes at rallies. Oh, we soon forget. So if his campaign is any guide, Mr. Trump seems likely to enthusiastically embrace the aggressive crackdown on journalists and whistleblowers that is an important yet little understood component of Mr. Obama's presidential legacy. But Trump hasn't done that. Criticism of Mr. Obama's stance on press freedom, government transparency, and secrecy is hotly disputed by the White House. But many journalism groups say the record is clear. Well, they were very quiet about it. Over the past 8 years, the administration has prosecuted 9 cases involving whistleblowers and leakers, compared with only 3 by all previous administrations combined. It has repeatedly used the Espionage Act, a relic of World War I era red baiting, not to prosecute spies, but to go after government officials who talk to journalists. Of course, they never used it to go after Hillary. Under Mr. Obama, the Justice Department and FBI have spied on reporters by monitoring their phone records, labeled one journalist an unindicted co-conspirator in a criminal case for simply doing reporting, issued subpoenas to other reporters to try and force them to reveal their sources and testify in criminal cases. Sounds like Robert Mueller, actually. Now there is somebody who's going after freedom of the press. I'm not done. I'll be right back. I will soon continue with this article written by this New York Times investigative reporter. And it's not even to show the hypocrisy of the left and these reporting organizations. It's more. It's to show you real threats to freedom of the press versus claims of threats to freedom of the press. When the President of the United States or his staff tells a reporter for CNN, you're way out of line the way you conducted yourself, that's not a threat to freedom of the press. A threat to freedom of the press is if you have reporters yelling stuff, talking over each other, refusing to leave the Oval Office. So the American people, after all, it's our country. We're not going to get the information. And in her case, of course, she wasn't interested in anything that was going on in the Oval Office. She wanted to talk about Michael Cohen because CNN's been working with him and Lanny Davis. And she wanted to keep pushing that narrative, and they wanted to get their ratings up, and they wanted to do this, and they have their own agenda. And then they wrap themselves in freedom of the press. They are free to do that, but not after the question time is done, and they're in the Oval Office, and they're asked to leave. I mean, is there really any question about access to Trump and his people? Far more than Obama ever provided. Or many presidents, for that matter. This is a New York Times reporter. Says, I experienced this pressure firsthand when the administration tried to compel me to testify to reveal my confidential sources in a criminal leak investigation. Did that happen to CNN? The Justice Department finally relented, even though it had already won a 7-year court battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court to force me to testify, most likely because they feared the negative publicity that would come from sending a New York Times reporter to jail. In an interview last May, President Obama pushed back on the criticism that his administration had been engaged in a war on the press. He argued that the number of leak prosecutions his administration had brought had been small and that some of those cases were inherited from the George W. Bush administration. But critics say the crackdown has had a much greater chilling effect on press freedom than Mr. Obama acknowledges. In a scathing 2013 report for the Committee to Protect Journalists, Leonard Downey, a former executive editor of the Washington Post, who now teaches at Arizona State University, said the war on leaks and other efforts to control information was the most aggressive I've seen since the Nixon administration, when I was one of the editors involved in the Washington Post investigation of Watergate. When Mr. Obama was elected in 2008, press freedom groups had high expectations for the former constitutional law professor, particularly after the press had suffered through 8 years of bitter confrontation with the Bush administration. And it goes on, and it lays it out, chapter and verse. Trump hasn't done any of that. All they did was tell this young lady who was out of line that she was out of line. But let me say this about the American press corps today. It's worse than anything I've ever seen. It's more ideological than any time in modern history. There's more groupthink and group reporting, which is why I wasn't surprised why they all came to defend this young lady, than I've ever seen. We have issues out there that are never reported on. Big issues. Issues that threaten this society. When's the last time, as I said the other day, we had concentrated reporting for 24 hours on our massive national debt? When's the last time we had concentrated reporting on the coming collapse of Social Security and Medicare? These are huge programs that affect tens of millions of people. When's the last time we had concentrated reporting on student debt, which is massive? When's the last time we had concentrated reporting on the threat that China poses to this country, stealing our technology, shaking down companies that do business in China, their military buildup and all that? When is the last time? And I could go on and on. We have huge issues that are thoroughly relevant to our lives, to our country. And then when you see these same so-called media outlets spend weeks on Stormy Daniels, spend weeks on Michael Cohen and Lanny Davis, spend weeks on these various issues because they want to take out Trump, because they're myopic and they're obsessed and they're frenetic about it. Don't tell us about the damage Trump's doing to freedom of the press. You're damaging freedom of the press. You're unprofessional. Your priorities are skewed. You're ideologically driven. You carry the ball for the Democrat Party more times than not. You treat conservatives like we're reptiles at the zoo. And you won't self-identify. You won't label yourselves what you actually are. CNN is a left-wing network. It's not a news network. MSNBC is a left-wing network. Fox is a right-of-center network. They try far more than the others, I will say. The New York Times is a left-wing newspaper. The Washington Post is a left-wing newspaper. You can go down the line and look at the people they hire. So from the get-go, they are completely dishonest, intellectually and otherwise, about what they really are and what they really do. Now, they have every right to do it. Nobody's challenging that. So their press freedom is not threatened. But when you go in the Oval Office, act like a professional. You can ask tough questions, not 6. When you're asked to leave, like everybody else, you leave. I gave you a little history of the presidential press conference. They're not in the Constitution. It's not a constitutional right. They used to be off the record. Presidents used to use them to advance their own cause. But we have a very different situation right now. Too often than not, unprofessional individuals who seek to promote themselves in order to make more money, in order to get higher ratings, in order to get their own TV shows and radio shows. In other words, people who are there for themselves, and then they wrap themselves in freedom of the press. So if the president calls them out, or you call them out, or I call them out, we're not threatening freedom of the press. We're pointing out some jackass or some network that clearly goes this way or that way. That's called freedom of speech. And there's nothing wrong with it. I just wish that these same people felt the same way about the rest of the Constitution, which they clearly do not. Like the amendment that follows the First Amendment, the Second Amendment. Or as I said earlier, a number of the issues within the First Amendment. Like religious liberty, which many of them don't believe in. Well, the media. So it's not a matter of whether the press should be aggressive. It's not a matter of hypocrisy. That is, when the Democrats are in power, we don't want them throwing out our people. If somebody's in there doing the same thing, they should be treated the same way. But there's a lot of questions here. Who decides which news outlets are in the Washington press corps? Why are they for the most part, the same news organizations. We have an enormous number of news outlets, and they're not all these traditional outlets with new technologies and new communication methods. You have all kinds of internet reporters and news websites and so forth. Are they properly represented in the Washington Press Corps? How about regional news operations and local news operations? Are they properly represented? I mean, do we need a baseball stadium filled of quote-unquote reporters to make sure we're upholding freedom of the press? Or, I'll even go further, what is with this oligopoly? Only certain media outlets get certain seats assigned to them in the White House press room. It raises a lot of questions as far as I'm concerned. All reporters aren't disruptive. You notice? They can ask tough questions, and they do. They can ask tough questions under the right environment, in the right circumstances, and they do. For this young lady, it was her behavior. And yes, we can expect reporters to have respect for the office of the presidency if they expect us to have respect for them. I'll be right back. Must be a slow day over there at Media Doesn't Matter for Un-Americans over there. George Soros and other left-wing kooks fund it, or did. Listen to this, Mr. Producer. You know, it was on Sean's show. We had a little fun like we used to have for about 10 minutes. On Hannity's radio show, Fox News host Mark Levin bashes Fox News for occasionally allowing Democrats on the air. It was a joke, you morons. Wow. Spread that around. Sometimes I have to turn it off because you have some of these Obama people on. These people are pathetic. Absolutely nuts. But that's okay. We know who they are and what they are. Let us go to Vasily in Mount Holm, Arizona, I believe. KWHN. How are you?
I'm very good. Good
looks
evening,
actually looks like Arkansas. Go ahead.
Good evening, sir. I am very nervous. I have not ever done this before.
Yes.
I am a Russian. I am of a family of Russian immigrants, political immigrants.
Yes, yes.
From 1980s.
Okay. How may I help you?
I would like to raise a point. I would love to have a conversation with you for one thing.
Yes.
But I need to be short, and I totally do understand. Now,
yes.
Listening to the rhetoric on Nancy Pelosi, I never have liked her physically or speech-wise. I'm sorry if I'm breaking. You may interrupt me any time.
Yes.
There has been a language that has been invented in Russia, okay, that was, in a way, if I may explain, a total political gibberish.
Yes.
Okay. It made no sense. You can listen to it all you wanted to, but there was no ins and outs. It was just a specific language. And those there are listening and know of this, they know it well.
You mean like CNN?
I don't listen much to news. I try to avoid all of that. It's very depressing.
But that's what happens. I mean, CNN's like our version of Russia TV. Vasily, I apologize. We have to run. That's what that music means. Call again, my friend. I shall return.